and as well as his service during the Revolution. In 1792, Isaac married his second wife, Mary Chin of Lancaster County, and they had 10 children, all but one of whom survived to adulthood, which is really rather remarkable when you think about it. The next date is 1812, 1813, which is when Isaac Bowman decided that Fort Bowman was probably not large enough for his family or grand enough, and so he built a house known as Mount Pleasant, which stands adjacent to Fort Bowman on the same, essentially the same property, and he actually constructed a road that would link the two properties. Between 1817 and 1821, there's some original correspondence that I came across at the Virginia Historical Society between Isaac Bowman and his cousin Isaac Hite of Belle Grove. They were bickering about fences and maintenance and care of those fences. I somehow would have thought they would have had more to worry about than the condition of one fence, but lengthy letters were exchanged between the two gentlemen, and they sort of tell you a little bit about what was important in the early 19th century when you owned property. In 1826, Isaac Bowman died. He left a very interesting will, which is very convoluted and which led to later lawsuits. But one of the things he did do, which was very distressing to historians of today, is that he specifically directed that an inventory not be made of his estate. And one of the most valuable printed resources that historians have are those wonderful inventories and appraisals that are made of large estates. But he specifically directed in his will that no such inventory was to be taken. Ultimately, a lawsuit ensued in the following 15 years or so, and there was an appraisal which led to another document which was of particular interest to me, which was a list of all of Isaac Bowman's slaves who were then living, with their names and their birth dates. Understand that often inventories will say that a property owner had 15 slaves and they were, 4 of them were under age 10 and 6 of them were between 10 and 16 and so on. But in this case, you actually had the names and the exact birth dates of all of Isaac Bowman's slaves that were still living in 1838 and 1839. So that was a find that I found very, very useful, and I shared it with Roki Jobs, whom many of you all may know, who is the historian for the Bowman family. And he, of course, has pursued it even further, and we have looked at, and he has secured copies of, the incredibly lengthy lawsuit that was filed on behalf of some of the Bowman heirs. That's a job for another day. It would take another couple of years to go through this 50 or 60 page written document and ascertain whether there is any information in that that may indeed refer to Fort Bowman. In 1840, the census records for Shenandoah County record that George M. Brinker and his wife Mary Ann were living in Shenandoah County. Now, Mary Ann was Mary Ann Bowman, and she was the person who ultimately inherited Fort Bowman. So in all the division in this great lawsuit, she became the owner of the Fort Bowman property. And she married her first cousin, George Brinker. By 1851, George Brinker and his family were indeed living at Fort Bowman, so we knew that. That's another important date. In 1853, by which time the Brinkers had, I think, 6 children. It just amazes me the speed with which these people had thousands of children. Makes me tired. Anyway, they sold their property known as the Stone House Tract. There's no other name given to the property, but that was what it was referred to, as to Henry Kern. Now, there are a number of Kerns in Shenandoah County, but this gentleman's name was Henry, and his wife was Rebecca. She actually had a middle name or a maiden name of Bowman, but it was not the same Bowman family that lived at Fort Bowman. In 1863, Henry and Rebecca Kern died in the same year, not at the exact same time. And there are several very sad stories about that, particularly about Rebecca Kern, who died because she cared for a young soldier who had smallpox, and she caught smallpox and died. There was a lot of contention over the property known as Fort Bowman, because Henry and Rebecca Kern had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and she had a son by her former marriage to a man named Hockman. And ultimately, that estate was settled, and Sarah Hankins, who was Henry Kern's oldest daughter, married George Amos Hankins. And one of the complicating factors in this research was that sometimes George Amos Hankins shows up as just Amos Hankins, sometimes as G.A. Hankins. So in looking at the census records and the agricultural census records and documentation, he's often referred to in different ways, which is just one of those little challenges that you have when you're working with some property. By 1870, which was very interesting, the census records indicate that George Amos Hankins and his wife had $1,000 worth of real estate and $800 worth of personal property. Now, that's doesn't sound like a lot today, but back then it was a great deal, particularly in 1870. Remember, much of this area, which I'm sure you all know, was devastated with the Civil War, and much of the agricultural wealth of the county was indeed destroyed in wartime activities. So when we see anyone who had $1,000 worth of real estate and $800 of personal property, it indicates that likely there had not been any physical damage of a large extent, anyhow, on the Fort Bowman property. The agricultural census by 1880 lists that on the property there were, quote, 7 houses of all ages as of June 1st, 1879. So that means that, assuming one of those 7 houses was the dwelling house, that there were at least 6 other structures on the property. And again, for Maral, this is an important sort of confirmation of the fact that there was indeed a fairly sophisticated farm complex on the property by 1880.